Okay, so now we're on chapter 2, section 1, and we're gonna go over some of the basics in this section. So, some definitions to cover first, which is consistent with what we've been saying before, before we talked about just linear increasing and decreasing and constant functions. Now we're going to talk about it in general. So on a given interval, if the graph rises, so if you go from left to right and it goes up, it's increasing. If it goes down from left to right, it's decreasing. Otherwise, if it stays the same, then it's a constant function. So the next part of that, I apologize for the little bit being cut off, but f is increasing. So a little bit more mathematical detail is if we have an interval where b is greater than a, right? So b is to the right of a, and f of b is greater than f of a, it means it's going up, right? So if the signs stay consistent with a, b, and then f of a and f of b, it's increasing on that interval, right? Because we're only looking at a to b. And on the other hand, the same exact definition and terminology, but if it switches, so a is less than b, but f of a is greater than f of b, means it's going down and means it's decreasing in that section, right? So when we talk about an interval, we're only looking at that piece. So regardless of what it does elsewhere, we're just looking at in that interval if it's increasing or decreasing. Last thing is if they're constant, right? So if a and b, where b is greater than a, it's an interval. If f of a and f of b is exactly the same, then the function is constant on that interval. Relative maximum and minimum. So suppose that f is a function for which f of c exists for some c in the domain of f. So this just means there's a function where we can find some values within the domain. If it's a relative maximum, then that means within a certain interval containing that value, we have that it's the highest point within that interval. Okay? And then on the other hand, relative minimum is it's the lowest point within an open interval. So let's look at it in terms of the graph, and it'll make a little bit more sense. So if we have a graph like this here, this is a relative maximum. The reason why we say it's relative, because clearly we have values here that are higher than this point. But it's relative because given an interval, let's say from C1 to C3, that's the highest point. Same thing with these values, right? You don't know because it says it continues on, so it might dip down below it, but it's a relative minimum because within a certain interval, that's the lowest point here, and C1 is the lowest point within these two places.